And welcome back to Capitol Tonight. So when Richard Ravitch was appointed lieutenant governor just over a year ago, he was touted by Governor Patterson as a fiscal crisis fixer. But over the past 14 months, the governor has made scant use of his number two. Now, Patterson fought all the way to the state's highest court for the right to appoint Ravitch, and he asked the veteran government expert to compile a deficit reduction plan. But Ravitch's plan to borrow billions of dollars as a bridge to reform the budget process drew only tepid support and was finally rejected by the governor. And since then, the lieutenant governor has kept a fairly low profile. Until today, that is. Now, Ravitch has surfaced to release a new report on the state's Medicaid system, which he calls the, quote, largest single driver of the state's growing expenditures. At a cost of $50 billion a year, this program, which provides health care for low-income New Yorkers, is easily the largest expense to taxpayers. And if changes are not made, the price tag could jump by more than $13 billion in the next 3 years. Richard Ravitch is here with me tonight to discuss this report. Lieutenant Governor, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So this report is actually pretty alarming if you look at the statistics, and I mean it makes it basically sound like if the state doesn't address this problem, it could very well go broke.
Well, you know, what's interesting about these facts is how few people have ever really focused on this. Obviously, the people in government understand the facts, so it's worrisome to them, but it's not new news. People don't know. It's amazing how few people understand that 1 out of every 4 New Yorkers are on Medicaid, that we spend close to $52 billion a year on Medicaid out of a total budget, all funds budget, of $145 billion. But it is also true that we provide health care for and long-term care for an awful lot of people in this state. And that is something that has to be weighed constantly against the expense.
Now, you actually make two interesting points. The first of which is that in 2014, because of the recently enacted federal health care reform, that increased numbers of New Yorkers are going to be enrolling in Medicaid, and that is going to further expand the cost. But, you know, a lot of critics of the New York Medicaid system say that it's the quote-unquote Cadillac of systems because it provides so many services. Would you advocate trimming those back? I know you have a lot of recommendations laid out here, but what about reducing the amount of services that people receive?
Well, I have not recommended that. I recognize that's a legitimate issue to be discussed, and I have no doubt it will be intensely discussed as the budget gets developed and worked out. I personally happen to believe in some form of universal health care. That's a matter of personal conviction. And the purpose of this report is not to make the judgment of what all the criteria of eligibility ought to be, but rather to say, whatever it is, we administer this in a kind of Rube Goldberg fashion. We divide responsibility between the state and the counties. Within the executive branch itself, we have several commissioners who are heavily involved in the administration of Medicaid. And on top of that, the legislature sets the rates. And I have suggested several serious reforms. One, that the rate setting be taken out of the control of the legislature and given to the state Medicaid director, to the Department of Health, that there be created a advisory commission similar to what the federal government has with respect to the Medicare program, that is nonpartisan and professionally, the people are professionally qualified. It's an advisory commission, but its advice would be public and should have a great deal of bearing on what the Medicaid Commission wants. Clearly, the legislature has and should have the ultimate power to appropriate money. So I'm not suggesting you can cut the legislature out of the process of deciding how much we spend on Medicaid. But as to the specifics of rate setting, New York is one of the few, if only state, where the the legislature gets involved to the extent that it does.
Now, wait, let me just interrupt just for 1 second, because I think that what we're talking about here gets a little bit unwieldy and difficult for people to understand. Just to break it down for 1 second, there's actually, Medicaid has a local share and a state share and a federal share, and you are also recommending that the state pick up all of the local share, but that's actually been tried. I mean, you're talking about changing a program that is a behemoth of a program that no one has managed to get their arms around.
I have, but actually the legislature in its wisdom this year provided for the ultimate takeover by the state. They directed the Department of Health legislatively to develop a plan for a state takeover.
Right.
So everybody knows that dividing responsibility for the administration of Medicaid between the counties and local governments and state government is not a rational, sensible, efficient way of running it. As to the question of picking up the share, which is now over $7 billion a year paid for by counties, I recognize that can't be done overnight given the state of the deficits that the state faces, but I have suggested that the Budget Division ought to prepare a plan for a takeover, ultimately, of the county share.
Okay.
And I would hope that would be taken seriously.
Okay. Part of the problem also is that have you spoken to the governor about this plan?
Well, I've shared it with him. I delivered it to him. I haven't had a chance to talk to him at length about it. He's in Buffalo today, but I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to chat in the near future.
Well, the reason why I ask is because he only has a scant few months left in his term, so we're about to go into a new governor's term, whoever that person may be. Have you spoken to either Andrew Cuomo or Carl Palladino about this particular plan?
I have not.
Okay, because the idea here is obviously the state's costs are going to balloon out of control, and whoever inherits the next government is going to have to deal with it. But it just seems that so many people have been talking about Medicaid for so long, and the legislature, yes, while they have passed this state takeover, it just seems like it's a long-term fix, and in the short term, costs just keep going up and up and up.
Yes, there isn't a magic bullet here. All you can really do is slow down the growth rate. If you want to dramatically reduce eligibility, even that's a problem, because under the Obama health care bill, you can't reduce eligibility below what it was at the time that the federal law was enacted earlier this year. But let me say this. The fundamental problem is both the cost of Medicaid, because of the rather fractionalized way in which it's run, and the politicization of so much of the administration, but it's also a function of the fact that healthcare costs themselves, underlying healthcare costs, are going up at 2 to 3 times the rate of inflation in this country. And there's not much the state can do about it, but I've suggested some things it could do to address that, like spending more money on prevention with respect to issues like cardiovascular disease and childhood obesity and substance abuse.
You don't actually... You don't have a dollar amount, though, in this report, correct? Do we have any idea about how much money you might save?
No, it would be disingenuous to try to quantify this with precision. My chief objective in writing this report and making it public was to encourage what I hope would be a very public debate and discussion on these issues. There may be people with better ideas than mine, but we cannot sustain what we're doing now. It has to be addressed. I also wanted to remind people that the formula under which the federal government shares a percentage of the cost of Medicaid is very, very unfair to New York. We have too many poor people and too high a health care cost that doesn't reflect itself in the way the federal government's formula works. So we we get amongst one of the lowest shares of federal help on our Medicaid program of any state in the country. Mississippi gets 1.5 times as much as we get.
Do you think you've looked at actually some of what Andrew Cuomo, who's the front runner in the governor's race, has proposed in his new New York agenda? Do you think that will be sufficient to address this problem?
I mean, to be honest with you, I do not recall what he proposed in his initial submission, and I haven't had the opportunity to talk to him about it.
He hasn't gone into enormous detail. I think that a lot of what we're waiting to see, I mean, you're seeing these sort of broad strokes proposals, for example, by Carl Palladino, that he wants to cut the government spending by, 10 to 30% or whatever, depending on the day. I mean, let me ask you this. Do you believe that it's actually really possible, given the fractured nature of Albany and the partisan rhetoric that happens here, that they could deal with a problem as intractable as Medicaid?
Well, they have very, very limited choices. They're going to have a deficit. In my judgment, it could be as much as $10 or $11 billion in the next fiscal year. They cut a lot this year. And I think that every legislator and the governor-elect have an enormously difficult challenge. And they're going to have to deal with it in ways that nobody imagined. I mean, the deficit this current year remains, a portion of that remains with us, as has been pointed out. The problem has not been solved in its entirety. There are a lot of things that people hoped would happen that didn't happen. And I heard today that Dick Gottfried, who's chairman of the Health Committee in the Assembly, didn't like some of the ideas I suggested. I have a lot of respect for Dick, but the truth of the matter is he and his colleagues are going to have to figure out how to close this deficit, and that deficit is going to keep growing every year in the future unless fundamental things change. So it's very easy to object to any individual proposal, but you got to have an alternative, and I'm eagerly awaiting to hear what others suggest as a way of curbing the growth of the deficit, which the taxpayers of New York cannot sustain very much longer.
Well, we will be waiting for those proposals as well. I want to thank you very much in the meantime, Lieutenant Governor Ravitch. It's always great to talk to you.
Thank you. Same here.